So thank you again, Måns, for your willingness to present at the seminar and everyone else for joining. We are very pleased to hear your talk. And as I said, you have 45 minutes and 15 minutes for any questions. But if anybody would like to ask questions in the meantime, just raise your hand and I think it will be possible to ask.
Yep. Okay, very good. Thanks very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to be able to do this for this group. And as Lucas said, if there are questions during the talk, I'm very happy to address them. And I think that that will work well, especially since we're a fairly small group this afternoon. So I'm gonna try to share my screen. Should work. So, and if you raise your hand and I don't see it, maybe you can just intervene.
Yes, I'll intervene.
Yeah. All right. So this is a paper entitled Worker Turnover and Job Reallocation in Ethiopia. This is joint work with my colleague Admasu Shifero, who's at the College of William and Mary in the US. It's obviously work in progress. So comments and suggestions as to how we can extend or improve the analysis would be very, very welcome. Let's see here if I can figure out how to move across. Aha, okay, this seems to work. So what we do, we just say a few words about empirical content and what we're hoping to achieve. So as the title suggests, we study job dynamics, by which I mean job creation, job destruction, and employment growth in Ethiopia, in the private sector of Ethiopia. And we're going to do this using a matched employer-employee data set that has an interesting panel dimension also. Maybe a similar data sets exist for South Africa, but I certainly haven't seen similarly detailed data for the low-income African countries. As you probably know, there is an extensive literature on labor market dynamics and worker turnover in high and middle income countries. I'll got more to say about that a little later, but there is very little data on really low income countries. So it's a simple paper where we seek to fill a knowledge gap in what is known about labor market operations across countries, sort of filling this gap that is currently there for the poorest countries in the world. I would sort of characterize the paper as largely a descriptive paper. There is no sort of quasi-experimental design in the data, and so the results are not particularly informative, I think, about causal mechanisms, but we think that they are still interesting because they shed new light on labor market dynamics in this new sort of largely unexplored setting, which is the low-income country. We tried to compare our findings with similar studies on rich countries and middle-income countries, and I noticed that Andrew Kerr is in the group, and he's done related work for South Africa, which we're drawing on also in this paper. Just to tell you a little bit more about how we think the project sort of fits in with the literature. There are a couple of, or several, I should say, new papers looking at related issues related to labor market performance across the world, but also in middle-income countries and to some extent in lower-income countries. So some stylized facts are coming out of these papers. Let me just put those on the table here as sort of providing a backdrop to what we're going to do later. So One sort of fairly robust stylized fact seems to be that tenure tends to be shorter and separation rates higher in developing countries than in developed countries. So Donovan, Liu, and Schulman, recent paper where they collect labor force survey data across 42 countries, including Egypt and South Africa, but no other African country. They show that there's a lot of labor market flows are relatively higher in the poorer countries of their sample. That tenure is important, a more important correlate of the likelihood of remaining in a job in poorer countries, but also a more important correlate of wage profiles in poorer countries compared to richer countries. Another study by Feng, Lagerkos, and Rauch looks at the relationship between unemployment and levels of development proxied by GDP per capita, and sort of looks at that specifically for low educated workers, which I think is of particular relevance for our project. So while unemployment and GDP per capita, for low educated, you find that unemployment rates are actually higher in the richer countries than in the poorer countries. And they can even show that in some poor countries, low educated workers sometimes have lower unemployment rates than high educated workers. And for sub-Saharan Africa, there's a recent paper in the EJ by Rud and Trapesnikova showing a number of stylized facts, which they attempt to explain using a model. I'm not talking about their model, but they show data indicating that this is well known, I think, that the share of workers in wage employment in sub-Saharan Africa is very low relative to middle-income countries, but the overall labor force participation rate is high. So workers participate in the labor market, but relatively less so in the wage sector, the formal wage sector, than in countries. So most of what I've just talked about is based on survey data, I think. And I mentioned earlier that we have access to matched employer-employee data where we can track both firms and workers over time. Evidence from such data remains very scarce, I think, for low-income countries, simply because such data sets don't exist to a great extent in low-income countries. So using this, we can kind of shed light on some aspects of labor market dynamics that I think one can pin down in a more direct way when we can follow a set of workers and a set of firms over. The focus is on Ethiopia. So this is one of a large set of low-income countries that are struggling despite extended periods of growth. They're struggling to expand formal employment. So in that sense, I think that Ethiopia is an interesting case study of labor market dynamics for that particular context. So for Ethiopia, still is the case that despite a decade of rapid growth, you have approximately 80% of the population still employed in agriculture. If you look at unemployment rates in urban areas, these remain high, and especially youth unemployment. According to official statistics, youth unemployment in urban areas has been about 25% persistently over the past 20 years. This is a country where you'd think that the labor market is not sort of strictly regulated. There are no minimum wages, for example, in the private sector. Unemployment benefits do not exist de facto. And labor unions are typically very weak. So you think that this is a labor market where firms are relatively unconstrained as to how they can, unconstrained by the regulatory framework as to how they can source workers from the labor market. So I think that, so I stress the regulatory aspects there. From an information point of view and from the point of view of sourcing relevant skills, matters are very different. I think in those dimensions, firms are struggling greatly, actually. So we have a setting that we study. So essentially an urban labor market characterized by rapid labor force growth, high unemployment rates, high self-employment rates, relatively low wages, and as I say, limited sort of regulatory restraints on hiring and firing from a legal point of view or from the unions. Let me talk about the data for a little while. So this is a register data, a large register of firms and workers that come from the private organization's employees social security agency, ERSA, in Ethiopia. The data set covers the period from September 2011 to September 2018 on a biannual basis. So periods here are 6 months. So what is POESA? So POESA was established in June 2011 to manage a new pension scheme for a segment of the private sector. So just want to be clear on some issues related to the representativeness of the data, and I'll also talk about what kind of information is actually in the data. So regarding representativeness of the data, it is not a representative sample of, well, the working population of Ethiopia for sure. It's not a representative sample of the formal sector. It's a more narrow, it's just a subset of that. So what does it represent actually? So it depends on what the pension scheme covers. So the pension scheme applies to all formal private sector firms with at least one employee. So not covered by the scheme, and so we will not have data on civil servants and public sector workers, employees of state-owned enterprises, so those are not included here. We have no data on the self-employed. We have no data on informal workers. So it's just important to remember that those, and these are especially, informal workers and self-employed are important, large subsets of the labor market in Ethiopia. We don't have data for those groups. It should also be noted that, and this relates to the sort of country-specific way in which the pension scheme was introduced. So the pension scheme was introduced, as I say, around 2011. It was a mandatory scheme that applied for all firms that did not have previously a voluntary pension contribution scheme. So some firms had what is known as provident funds and had that for some time before the new pension scheme was introduced. So firms that had PFs, they were allowed to keep them, and therefore were not required to contribute to the new pension scheme because they already had some equivalent arrangement. So that's kind of important to know. However, all firms that were established after 2011 will be, in principle, obliged to participate in the new pension scheme. So netting out the firms that, for various reasons, then are not included because they had PFs, we sort of estimate that the new pension scheme would cover at least 80% of formal private sector firms that were established before 2011 and all firms that were established after 2000. Now, the new pension law was not perfectly enforced, and we know that there are firms that manage to go under the radar and not register with ERSA, even though they should do so. It's hard to say for sure what percentage of private employers that dodge the system. We sort of have some reason to believe that small firms are probably underrepresented in the data, which one could or should keep in mind as we look at the numbers on labor flows, which I'll come to soon. So about information in the data set. So this, as I say, is a large data set, but it's not sort of a hugely rich data set in terms of variables. So it contains worker level information on wages and other benefits, sex, and age. And there is, in addition to that, establishment level information on sector and location. And that is more or less it. That's more or less what is available on a systematic basis. In addition to that, as I said earlier, so individuals and firms have unique ID numbers. So that is a big deal in this context, because we can then construct a panel, linked employer-employee panel data set, where we can track workers who move across firms over time. It also enables us to construct measures of tenure and experience. We can construct experience based on age, and we can construct a measure of tenure based on how long we see a worker being with a particular. Obvious disadvantage of the dataset is that we don't have, or limitation of the dataset is that we don't have information on workers' education or occupation. Occupation, I think, would have been really nice, but maybe we can come back to that in the discussion. So the maximum sample of the data is a little more than 1.5 million workers that are matched with approximately 50,000 firms. So for the full panel, we're looking at nearly 5 million worker observations, N times T, so to speak, and the total number of establishment observations, around 230,000. The quality of the data, it's hard, I think, to assess it in further detail, at least given the information that we have. So as I I alluded to earlier. So we know that not all firms comply with the law. So the coverage of firms is not 100%. And I also think that the coverage of workers for included firms is probably also less than 100%. But even so, descriptive statistics seem to be consistent with, descriptive statistics on these labor market measures that have been reported in other studies, and also patterns of firm behavior and in the labor market. So we kind of take that as at least that's provides some reassurance that the data is not overly misleading. So most of the paper is related to job and worker flows, and there's a large literature on job and worker flows, and we're going to follow that literature closely when it comes to definitions of key variables, but also when it comes to how the analysis is done. And the latter point is important for comparability, which is one of the things that we want to do, compare our results to findings for other countries. So I don't know how familiar this is to people. Let me just go through it quickly. So hiring rate, so number of workers hired over a 6-month period divided by average employment over that period. Separation rate, number of workers that left the firms over a 6-month period divided by total employment. So those are easy and obvious. Perhaps the two most sort of central measures of job and worker flows in the paper are the worker flow rate, WFR, the third bullet here. So that's the number of hired plus number of separated workers divided by total employment over the period. That's the first, I think, very central measure. The second very central measure is the job flow rate, which is penultimate bullet. JFR. So that's the absolute difference between hiring and separation divided by employment. So based on worker flow rate and job flow rate, we compute the excess worker flow rate and refer to that measure as churning. So that's the last bullet there. So how do we interpret the measure of churning? So I think one way of interpreting that is that as a measure of the mobility of workers over and above the rate that is required to match firms' employment adjustments from one period to another. So it follows from the definitions here that whenever a firm is hiring workers and experiencing workers leaving the firm at the same time, there will be churning according to this definition. So, a little example here. So if the separation rate is 10% and the hiring rate is 10%, then the net employment growth is 0, but there is 20% excess worker flow. So there's been worker reallocation, but no new jobs yet have been created in this little example. So I'm gonna go straight to the data at this point and just show you the numbers for Ethiopia, and I'm gonna. This is table 1 in the paper, so I'm gonna focus first on the left panel of the table, so all establishments, and look at column 2, which is the mean. So I think let's go through this slowly. So we have a hiring rate of about 20% and a separation rate of about 18%. And we have a net employment growth rate of 2.4%. So we see some positive employment growth on average in the data, but it's not sort of very rapid employment growth. Remember, this is over six-month period. So it immediately then follows that these relatively high hiring and separation rates combined with limited net employment growth will imply a high worker flow rate, right? And a high level of churn. So we're looking at the overall worker flow rate of 38%. So you can approximately interpret that as saying that 2 out of 5 private sector employees at any given point in time have been either hired or separated over the preceding 6 months. Okay, no. Okay. So that's the first set of observations. The overall job flow rate, so that's job creation plus job destruction, is 20%, which, as I said earlier, implies substantial worker churn. So workers move across establishments to a much greater extent that will be sort of necessary to accommodate job creation and destruction by the employers. So this discrepancy then is the churning at 18.2%. So another way of thinking about the 18.2% is that churning accounts for nearly half, not quite half, of the overall worker turnover rate, while the rest, the 38%, while the rest is attributable to reallocation of jobs across establishments or job flows. We thought it'd be interesting to look in greater detail at these numbers, distinguishing growing and contracting firms. And it's kind of interesting that if you sort of categorize firms into growing, contracting, and no change, that's a sort of an equal division into a third each, approximately. So a third of the firms are growing, another third is contracting, and another third is there's no change. So if you look at the hiring in the private sector, so 79% of all hiring occurs among growing establishments, and 69% of the separations take place among downsizing establishments. We don't have, it's hard without a benchmark to say anything as to whether that is atypical or not. So it's almost like, so the third point, is that these numbers also imply that there's considerable rates of separations among growing firms, and similarly, quite a lot of hiring going on among downsizing establishments. So that's kind of an interesting, I think, stylized fact perhaps coming out of our data. So how does this compare then to what has been documented for other countries? So we've tried to identify as many published papers as we could. We missed a few, but this at least is a collection of studies for mostly rich countries, but also some middle-income countries, including South Africa, which is Andrew's work. There's also Mexico and Colombia in our set of comparisons countries. This is all about worker flow rates. So this is the turnover, hiring plus separation divided by size. And naturally, there's lots of caveats here. There will be differences across the studies in the type of data that is used and its representativeness for sure at the country level. There would also be differences in the time periods, the time windows at which these data are observed across the countries. So we try to address that to sort of annualize all the data so that at least in that sense, the numbers are comparable. If we look at the countries at the top of the table here, we have European countries. In the upper half of the table, we have France, Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, and Italy. In most cases, these are old data now. So we'll have another look to see if we can have more updated numbers. So, but for these studies, worker turnover rates are relatively low compared to the other countries, varying from about 25% in the Netherlands to 61% in Italy. If you look at the US, worker turnover rates are much higher. You see the last column here. So, and if you dig a little deeper, you find that excess turnover, i.e. churning, plays an important role for driving this wedge in the worker turnover rates between the US and the European countries. So for the middle-income countries, Andrew's work on South Africa corresponds to his numbers imply a worker turnover rate of about 53%. So that's sort of in the European range and somewhat lower than what we obtained for Ethiopia once we convert the numbers into annual counterparts. The 0.76 here, so that's essentially 2 times the 0.38 that we showed for Ethiopia earlier. Mexico, similar to Ethiopia, Colombia somewhat higher, but not as high as the US. So the picture that kind of emerges here is that worker turnover rates in low and middle income countries lie in between those observed in Europe and what has been shown, what has been reported for the US. So here is a little bit of a further analysis on these measures of worker and job turnover related to establishment size. So we distinguish 5 size groups here. We find that worker turnover tends to decline with establishment size. It's a fairly, if you look at the worker flow rate, so just H plus S divided by employment, hiring plus separations. So penultimate row in table 3 in the upper panel. So it sort of ranges between 42 and 47% for firms with less than 100 employees, For firms with more than 100 employees, the worker flow rate is considerably low. And similar pattern can be documented for churning, so excess turnover. The last row of the upper panel of the table, stable amongst small and medium-sized firms and dropping fairly sharply once we pass the 100 worker size threshold. We kind of looked at this in more detail for South Africa based on Andrew Kerr's work, and our results are qualitatively similar to what Andrew found. So, an inverse relationship between establishment size and worker turnover, although I think our gradient is probably higher than what Andrew finds for South Africa. We document these numbers, document variation across job and worker flows across sectors, locations, and over time. I'm not going to show you detail because we don't have much time. I can just summarize. We see considerable variation in worker mobility across sectors. So mobility is relatively low in the manufacturing sector and relatively high in the construction sector. And that's consistent with many previous studies for other more developed countries. We find, let's see, sorry about this. No obvious, the last bullet here, so there's no obvious relationship. So remember, we have this 7-year period over which we can observe some macroeconomic fluctuations, but we cannot really see an obvious relationship between macro fluctuations and fluctuations in worker and job flows at the establishment level. And that's a little different compared to, for example, the US, where it has been documented that churning is pro-cyclical, as Jürgen Spletzer as a So now I'm going to look briefly at some implications of worker turnover and churning. So first thing we do, so we're now going to do this by means of regression analysis. I want to be strict on myself and not necessarily talk about causal effects. So all these, but I will not. I will probably say that such and such variable has an effect on the dependent variable. But what I really should be saying is that there is a partial correlation. All right. So we examine the relationship between job and worker flows at the establishment level using regression, where we model net employment growth as the dependent variable and as a function of a small number of explanatory variables, including churning. Churning lagged. And so essentially the question underlying this part of the analysis is whether excess worker turnover at the level of the firm hampers growth. That's the question. So this is kind of descriptive evidence, sort of to some extent answer that question. So we find that there is a negative and statistically significant relationship between lagged churning and employment growth. So the panel fixed effects results suggest that reducing churning, worker churning, by 10 percentage points would be associated with an increase in net employment growth over the subsequent period by about 1/3 of a percentage point. So this is consistent with the findings of Burgess and others, and sort of is consistent with the view that excess turnover is costly for firms in that it constrains their ability to grow employment. So we've documented significant sort of worker turnover and churning. And one interesting question we think is whether that is then part of an assortative matching process. You know, there's worker dynamics, and maybe that is just part of a process by which high productivity workers tend to sort into high productivity firms, assortative matching. So we can't investigate this issue directly. A direct investigation, I think, would involve looking at the workers shifting between jobs to see if they move into you know, a better fit over time, but that in terms of their productivity. So that we can't do, but we can provide some indirect evidence on whether, you know, this labor market can be characterized by assortative matching. And we do that by following, and many people have followed in these footsteps by Abbott, Kramaj, and Margolis, to analyze wage equations that, or estimate wage equations that include worker fixed effects as well as firm fixed effects. And then especially study the relationship between these two fixed effects. So in a setting where workers and firms are engaged in an assortative matching process, you would expect the two fixed effects to be positively correlated, i.e. you would expect to see that high productivity workers sort into high productivity firms. So that's what we're going to do. So we can identify firm and worker fixed effects separately because we have a subsample of workers who move between firms in the sample over time. I'm just going to summarize the results here. So we find, this is probably not such a big surprise. So worker fixed effects account for a very large share of the variation in wages, nearly 3/4. Firm fixed effects account for 8% of the variation in wages. And related to the issue of assortative matching, so we look at how the worker and firm fixed effects are correlated, we find a negative correlation. 0.17, a moderate negative correlation between the worker and the firm fixed effect. And the latter result is at least qualitatively similar to results that have been reported for France and Germany and Austria. For the US, the studies that we've seen report correlations that are close to zero, actually. So in other words, we haven't come across any study that document a strong positive correlation between the worker and firm fixed effects and our data sort of fits in that pathway. So sort of a conclusion here is that the lack of evidence in support of associative matching suggests that we're looking at, you know, a setting in which there's a process by which workers move between jobs at a fairly high rate. But they do this in a setting where this is not related to a sort of a systematic sorting process. So the mobility that we see doesn't seem to contribute to a better matching between workers and firms. Maybe. Slightly running out of time, we've looked at to what extent worker turnover implies foregone gains from tenure. So the thinking here is that if there are high returns to firm-specific tenure, then as workers leave the firms, then such that firm-specific knowledge that has been acquired by working in the firm is lost. So we run conventional wage equations to the extent that we can do that with the data at hand, and find that our results look very similar to what has been shown, regarding wage profiles, wage experience, and wage tenure profiles for other countries. So the returns to tenure, which is the worker spell variable here. So for the entire sample, so that's 2.3% a year. That's not atypically high, but also not atypically low. So the answer to the question in the rubric is that to some extent, the worker turnover does seem to imply that the gains from tenure are lost, but the economic loss from the turnover process is probably not overly serious. We're gonna finally look at two more regressions. We're gonna see how past growth relates to current worker turnover, and then we're gonna end the analysis here, end the presentation by looking at determinants of worker separation at the individual level, the worker level. So here we're gonna model churning at time t as a function of firm size, wage level in the firm, and net employment growth in the previous period. Again, this draws on the analysis by Burgess for the US in an old paper. So in panel A, I think that's the most, in the interest of time, I think I'll focus on panel A. So the dependent variable, as I say, is excess turnover or churning. We find a positive coefficient on past employment growth. In other words, firms that have experienced relatively high employment growth previously seem to experience a higher contemporaneous churning rate. So a similar result has been documented for the US. So maybe that that suggests at least that if there is a period of rapid hiring and extensive hiring, you'd see a subsequent period characterized by more separations and more movement of workers out of the firm. Finally, the worker level analysis. So here, and this is then different compared to all the analysis that you've seen so far. This is a regression estimated at the level of the worker I, and we model probability of worker I leaving their job at firm J at time period T. And this is, I'm just showing you one of the regressions that we show in the paper. So this is logit average marginal effects on the probability of a worker-firm separation. So just to summarize the results, all of these results are highly statistically significant. You would expect them to be, given that we have more than 2 million observations. So we see higher separation rates at the individual level for younger workers, for those who recently joined the firm, for low-wage workers, and for workers in low-wage firms. And we also see a relationship between firm size and the probability of worker-level separations. So there's a quadratic effect there, implying that all else equal, you see that in firms with you see atypically high separation rates in firms with approximately 20 workers, and beyond that size, the probability of separation tends to fall. So conclusions very quickly. The setting is one where we have relatively slow employment growth and relatively high worker turnover rates. So they fall in between levels that have been documented for Europe and levels for the US. We find that churning is negatively associated with subsequent net employment growth, suggesting that excessive churning hampers the firm's ability to grow. We looked at returns to experience and tenure, and maybe I should just skip that, refer to the paper if you're interested. We find that rapidly growing firms risk a higher subsequent churning rate, consistent with the notion that extensive hiring in a short period reduces average job match quality. No evidence that this labor market is characterized by strong worker-to-firm assortative matching. So we have this overall pattern for this labor market, in which workers move fairly frequently across establishments, but they do so for reasons that do not seem to be related to productivity in any clear way. And in the final part of the paper, we study patterns of worker separation, but we just did that, so I don't need to repeat what came out of that part of the analysis. So that's all I had at this point. So happy to take questions or comments if there are any.
Thanks a lot, Måns, for a very interesting presentation. We have time for any questions. Anybody would like to ask questions right now? Okay, Andrew, please go ahead.
Hi, Måns. Nice to see you very much. I had a few small questions. When you're talking about coverage in the beginning, is there a household survey or something like that that you could compare to that asks questions, say, do workers work in the formal sector, and figure out how many of those there are?
Yeah, we haven't done that. That would be, I think, a useful way of checking the representativeness of the data.
Okay. And then, yeah, you talked about the fact that this excludes informal firms, and then you talked about non-compliance. So I was just wondering if those two things could be thought of exactly equivalent. So by definition, an informal firm is non-compliant, and therefore your coverage is 100% of formal firms.
Well, that's an optimistic, I think, view. I think that for sure all the informal firms are not included in the data. But we also strongly suspect, or even we know, that there is a collection of, or a number of firms, formal firms, that really should register, but they don't do that.
Okay. I was desperately trying to think of the reason for a belief in my mind, and I couldn't during your presentation. I feel like that maybe multiplying by 2 or by 4, if you have quarterly or biannual data, might overestimate the amount of flows compared to if you have like a full year. So I guess you could check that in your data, since you, but I can't remember the reason for that, and so maybe that's wrong. But anyway, that was a thought that came to me during the talk. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Anybody else would like to ask any questions? Okay, I have a question. I must say I'm not from the field, so this is pretty new to me. With respect to the assorted matching that you discussed and the regressions that you run for individuals and firms, I was wondering, like, maybe this is obvious, but why the R-square is so high for individuals and so low for firms, and what sort of other variables are used to explain this? And then also, what may be the reason why there's no assorted matching for Ethiopia? Like, is it something that you would expect, or how does it work for other countries?
Yeah. Okay, so on the first question, I think this is what you expect if you have firms where you know, there are very different types of jobs within the firms. So, for example, if you have, let's say, accountants, you know, across firms, so each accountant presumably would have a relatively high worker fixed effect, and the accountant would, because the accountant is paid relatively well compared to, let's say, low skill factory workers. So I think the fact that that the worker fixed effects are so important in determining individual wages reflects that there is heterogeneity within the firms.
So it's not skilled based, it's more profession based, maybe, or something like that.
I think implicitly it is. I think, but you know, given that we are very limited in what we observe in the data, almost everything related to skills for us is unobserved. So in that sense, you know, in order to do the comparison with what has been found for other countries properly, I think you really have to be clearer than what we currently are on what is observed for the workers and what is unobserved for the workers. So the fixed effects will pick up what is unobserved, and what it picks up obviously depends on what you can condition on in the data. Yeah.
The negative correlation. Or...
Yeah, that's surprising. So in other words, it seems to be the case that you have high productivity workers sort of clustering in firms that are have an underlying relatively lower level of productivity. That's what the correlation says, sort of mechanically. It seems to me a fairly counterintuitive result. I agree with that. So our only sort of handle on this rather strange result at this point is the fact that this has been, similar results have been obtained in other countries. I know that there's an ongoing debate in the literature as to whether this method of estimating the relationship between firm fixed effects and worker fixed effects can be actually misleading, that the correlation can be biased for essentially sample size reasons. But I haven't looked at that issue in any greater detail.
I understand. Thank you for your answers. we still have time for our last question, maybe. Anybody else would like to ask something? All right, I guess there are no questions. So thank you again, Måns, for your presentation, and anybody else for attending. And I hope that we'll be able to see you soon in South Africa. So we'll be in touch.
Yeah, we'll be in touch. Well, thanks very much. Thanks for organizing and attending.
Thanks. Have a good day.
Bye now.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks very much. Thanks.